We are recording the interview of Fred Pumroy. This interview is being conducted by Jeremy Tack from the Wright State University's Veteran Voices Project. Also in attendance is Paul Cobb. This interview is being recorded at Wright State University in the New Media Incubator. It is 3:15 p.m. on the 23rd of March, 2018. Fred, thank you for being here. Really appreciate it. Let's start off with where and when were you born?
I was born in Hammond, Indiana, and November 27th, 1942.
Who were your parents and what were their occupations?
Neil and Vera Pumroy, and he started off as in the open hearth furnaces in Gary, Indiana, and then they moved out, and he got headaches, so he moved out to the farm. So when I was about 3 or 4, moved into the farm, and he was a farmer all of his life. So just a farmer.
Do you have any siblings?
Yeah, one brother, about 6 years older, Russell, and he went in the Army for a short tour, got drafted in, and that's about it. And then I came along, and.
Do you have any other family members that served in the military?
Well, no, my father got exempt because his brother got killed as a Marine. He was a paratrooper, and so he got killed in World War II, just before I was born. So he didn't have to go, but and some other uncles went, and some cousins. But.
So tell me, what did you do before you joined the military?
I actually just went to college, went to high school directly into college, went through ROTC and at Ball State University, and then that qualified me to become a pilot. It was an Air Force ROTC, and that was the days where they had the draft, and so. That encouraged me to join the ROTC. Plus, they gave a couple $100 a month, so I needed that to complete my board and room.
What year did you start going to college?
1960, and graduated in '64.
Okay. And what, besides the draft, what factors led to deciding to join the Air Force?
Well, when I was about 8 years old, my dad had and another farmer bought an old Army trainer airplane, and so I flew in that quite a bit. And he wouldn't let me land or take off, but I flew acrobatics, and so I got the bug. And then of course the opportunity to go in the Air Force ROTC. Though I wasn't that disciplined, but other than being in sports. And so sounded like a good way of going.
So tell me about ROTC. What was the training like?
Well, not too, it's the same as all colleges are now today. You just go through different classes on serving your community and how the military operates, and we also were able to get our private pilot's license at the time. And so it really wasn't a lot of, some marching, and just get you indoctrinated in how the Air Force operated.
What did your family think about it?
Well, they were no problem. Dad wanted to go, but he couldn't go because of his brother. But and my brother went, so there wasn't any problems.
So what was it like when you finally graduated and got your commission?
Well, right after I got commissioned, I had to wait until I got into pilot training for a couple of months. So, and during that time I got married, and so we moved on the farm. So I worked on the farm for a couple of months, and then till July the 10th when we had to report to pilot training. So drove my little bug down to Del Rio, Texas, where we started pilot training.
Tell me about that.
That was competitive. I was in 66A, which it was the first class that had the T-38 aircraft, which is supersonic aircraft. And so we pulled in, and of course we went past the base on the way to find a house, and smoke was coming out. It was a Thunderbird had crashed at the end of the runway, so my wife was a little apprehensive, I guess you'd say, of going to Paltry. And then, but then we reported in the next week and started ground training and had to go through the physicals and all that again. And they weeded out about 6 more guys. So I think we had 53 when we started, and then really competitive. I had half of our class was academy graduates. The other half were distinguished graduates, and then me. I was never distinguished graduate. I was the only one that got in there. I'm not sure how I did, but I got in there. Yeah, but it made it tough because you couldn't miss 1 or 2 questions and you'd flunk on the tests. And then luckily I had some experience in flying, so that wasn't so hard. But it was harder than college was, that's for sure. Pretty intense.
Tell me what some of the training was like. What kind of things did you learn?
Well, we went everything from aeronautics, aeronautical and physics, had navigational classes, and then so we'd do half a day of the academics, and then we'd fly the other half a day. So we did that for a year, and you had to take check raids at the end of every 6 months. Well, they started with the T-37s, which were slower, but they were jets, but they had side-by-side seats. And so you had an instructor, and they showed you the principles, how to fly, and instruments, formation, transition, which is all the aeronautics that the Thunderbirds do, same thing. And then at the end of each term or 6 months, you'd get check rides. And once you passed those, then you went on to the T-38 and went through that same thing. So
how long was the school total?
I think it was a year. No, I ended up with, let's see, I think it was a year and 3 months because I washed back, I got hepatitis. And so I had to drop back a class, and then I almost flunked out because I had I had a kid at the same time, plus when I get into formation or transition and do a loop, and coming out the back side, I'd gray out, so I couldn't see. I could feel, if it was in formation, I could feel the other airplane, the bubble, the burble. But then I slung out, so I got a fare, so I dropped down from the top of the class, or top 7 down to the bottom 7. It wasn't too much difference. So.
And I'm just curious, because I have a little flying experience myself. What's it like learning how to fly a jet?
Well, it's like flying a little airplane, except it's a lot faster. Not quite as loud. It's got a buzz sound and or whining sound, and with the jet engines. And you just have to be ahead of the airplane, and that's the hard part, because it's a lot of things quick, especially on the T-38, because it was supersonic, and when you release brakes, by the time it was like, a minute later you're off, and then another minute later you're at 10,000 feet, So you had to know where you was going, and then be able to, especially if you're on instruments, you had to predict where you were going to go, so you had to stay ahead of the airplane. It was a challenge,
Mm-hmm.
but it was exciting too.
Oh, imagine. So after this, what did it feel like to finally graduate and know that you're going to become a pilot in the Air Force?
Yeah, well, this made you proud. And had my mom and dad come down to the ceremony, and they had the big, parade and flyovers and all that stuff. But so yeah, it was cool to get your wings.
Mm-hmm. So what was the next step for you after that?
Then I ended up with assigned to the KC-135, which is a refueling tanker.
Mm-hmm.
And so I come home, I think, for about a month, and then I was supposed to report to the Stead Air Base, which was survival.
Mm-hmm.
And so I drove out there, and then after survival, which was about a month, and then you went and reported to Castle Air Force Base, which is where the KC-135 training was. Well, I get to Stead, and they informed me that they had changed my orders.
Mm-hmm.
I wasn't supposed to go there. I was supposed to go to Castle immediately.
Mm-hmm.
They tried to track me down across the country. Didn't find me. So then I just drove down to Castle. By the time I got down there, they said, "You're not, you're late, so we already replaced you."
Mm-hmm.
So I said, "What do I do now?" "Well, you got to go back to your base assignment." I said, "Where's that?" It was KI-SOAR in Michigan, which is up at Peninsula, Michigan. So I get up there, and this is where I've had just situations that have blessed me during the years, and that was really a blessing, because I get up there and I wasn't checked out, so I couldn't pull alert.
Mm-hmm.
So I got to fly as much as I wanted to.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'd jump on with the instructor pilots, and they'd let me fly, and then also went out for the base basketball team. So I was the only officer on a base basketball team, made
Mm-hmm.
that. So we traveled around on that, and then I had some other side jobs. Was in training, the training section, and so I was commander of that for a couple months, and then I helped with scheduling and all kinds of different maintenance,
Mm-hmm.
different jobs. So I really learned the operation and behind the scenes. So it was beneficial. And then in July the next year, I went to pilot training. So I was like 9 months later,
Mm-hmm.
and because it was a piece of cake, because I'd already checked out in the airplane,
Yeah.
really. So had a good time there, and then come back and got on a crew as co-pilot, and then we ended up in flying in refueling missions over Vietnam,
Mm-hmm.
out of Utapao Air Base in Thailand,
Mm-hmm.
and that's where the bombers and the tankers flew out of, and and that was like 2 months, so
Mm-hmm.
we got more flying time. And then the bombers had these 24-hour missions that they needed a third pilot. They call them Chrome Dome missions, and they flew over the North Pole refueling, or just being on alert for any Russian problems. And so I jumped on those about 4 times, and so I got, actually about 8 times. I got about 200 hours
Mm-hmm.
just on those missions. And so in effect, in 2 years, I had enough hours to become an aircraft commander.
Mm-hmm.
And the other guys that were there, they were all captains. I was still a lieutenant. And they were all captains, and were still co-pilots.
Mm-hmm.
And then a lot of them got out, they were getting out to go to the airlines. And so then they all left or signed up to resign, and so I was the only one left. So I became an aircraft commander in 1968,
Mm-hmm.
in 2 years. And so I owned crew as a lieutenant. So I was the youngest aircraft commander in Strategic Air Command at
Wow.
the time.
Mm-hmm.
So we did that for a year. Then, well, as a result of being aircraft commander, at the young age, I got selected to go to the Air Force Association convention to represent Strategic Air Command. And I was their junior officer of the year. So I went down there. Well, I found out they went to a lecture. They were lecturing on they needed pilots for Vietnam. So they said, anybody can volunteer for these fighters. And I really wanted a fighter. So I said, sir, they won't, Strategic Air Command and Military Air Command, they won't let us volunteer for fighters. You have to do conventional airplanes, which props. He says, that's not true. I said, well, that's what they're telling us. Well, you come up here after the meeting. So I went up there and see, we volunteered. He says, here, check what you want. So we did that, and about 2 months later, I got an assignment to OV-10s, and which I didn't know what it was at the time. Except the only thing I knew is one of the other pilots that had gone to Vietnam, he got killed in one. Oh. So that didn't make my wife very happy either. So anyways, off I went on the way to Vietnam. Well, the SAC guys didn't like it either, Strategic Air Command guys, because the squadron commander and the wing commander would give me the crew. They had visions that I'd be the youngest instructor pilot and all this stuff. And so I ruined their little plan too. So anyway, I went to Cannon Air Force Base and flew the AT-33s. It's where they call it the 90-day fighter pilot school. So you learned how to put in ordnances. It's where you had strafing and rockets and bombs. And so we learned what angles and what kind of ordnance to put in what kind of targets. And that's what the forward air controllers do in Vietnam. So that was going to be my job. So then that was 3 months. Then I went to Hurlburt Air Force Base and checked out in the OV-10. And then went over, hit jungle survival school in the Philippines on the way, and landed in Tan Son Nhut Air Force Base in Vietnam. And then there was like a 3 or 4 week school where indoctrination school. So you'd go around and they'd teach you how to, though we learned how to fly the airplane and do the reconnaissance and put in strikes. Vietnam, you couldn't see anything because it was all jungle, and most of it was jungle. So they'd teach you how to, see things under the trees and that kind of stuff. And then they had 2 different missions. One was in Vietnam, was low. You could get down to 1,500 feet. And there wasn't in 1970, this is 1970, so there wasn't too much action there like there was in 68 and 69. But they got mortared at what their home base was, where they were sleeping quite often. And then the other side was the Laos and the Ho Chi Minh Trail, where they were flying 4,500 feet to keep away from the small arms, and the 50 cal and the AK-47s. And you had the 23 millimeter, 37 millimeter, 57 millimeters guns shooting at you over there. So you got shot at every flight, but you didn't get mortared at night. So, and I chose that one because the first night we were in Vietnam, they had the radios come in. They had been mortared for 2 or 3 months. And that night about midnight, the radios are all welcome to the forward air controllers. And then about 1 o'clock, there were mortars started coming in. And one lit right outside my door. So I spent the rest of the night under the bed with my F-16 and helmet on. And so I decided then, I think I'd rather sleep at night and get shot at during the day than the opposite. So that's why I volunteered to Vietnam. So,
so tell me about Vietnam. What was it like being there?
well, it was, you really can't picture or feel it until you get there. And because now, while I was in Strategic Air Command refueling and flying out of Utapao, we were refueling the fighters. So we kind of knew that it was tough because we were flying the 105s or refueling the 105s and F-4s going into North Vietnam or bombing Hanoi at the time. In 1970, they couldn't go to Hanoi because they lost so many airplanes in 68 and 69. And we'd go down and we had these gaggles, they call them, for 64 airplanes. We had 16 tankers, and then we were refueling all the fighters. And when they came back out, you'd be missing one or two every time. And so they had a lot of losses. And so we knew it was tough over in that area. And then in Laos, they wouldn't let us fly over that, except for just going into Laos, because they had the 37, 57 millimeters that go up as high as we were. We didn't know that at the time. And then when I got over there as a forward air controller, then it was, well, in Vietnam, we didn't really see the flares, the tracers, because there wasn't big guns. But then when we got to Nakhon Phanom in Thailand, that's where we flew out of there, 23rd TAS, and in our OV-10s, and then we got, like I said, got shot at every day. So, but you could tell the ground rule was as long as the tracer was moving in your canopy, it wasn't going to hit you. If it didn't move, you better move. And so, and you had like 23 millimeters with 6 rounds, 6 tracers. 37 was 3, and 57 was 2. So, if you saw that, they were in clips, because there's more shells than that in there. But you knew where they were going, and you knew about how high they were, how far they were, from you, and so you could kind of tell when they were going to explode. And so most of them missed us. We still lost about 12 airplanes in the year, and about eight pilots. So didn't make it back, but and we had several missions, different kinds of missions at there. Mostly was introducing the roads. So you'd bomb the roads. Of course, they'd fix them overnight, but they'd keep the trucks from running at night. And then they would actually, the trucks would park up in the mountains on the Ho Chi Minh Trail, just in where North Vietnam and South Vietnam and Laos meet. And we called that 4 Alpha. And so that's where the trucks came in. And they'd just stay there until dark, and then they'd come down. Well, then we'd have the gunships, 130 gunships would take over from then. And we had some other facts that were night facts that had flares, and so you could find them. So we'd try to blow up their trucks and get supply areas. They had little caches along the river, and they would actually float barrels of stuff down the rivers, and they'd take big long bamboo poles out and collect them. And then so we'd try to find where they were storing them and blow those up. And then another part, you had another mission we had was flying with the Green Berets, and they would have one Green Beret sergeant with 4 or 5 North Vietnamese deserters that they'd picked up. And they were all stationed at Nha Can Phan. And so we'd fly with them, and we'd fly cover, and we'd have another sergeant in our back seat, and then we'd go find places for them to land, and then they'd take a helicopter and land in, and they'd stay out there a couple weeks until they got found. Mm-hmm. And then if they had got into a firefight, then we'd come in and rescue them. And so we did that, and then had some missions going into North Vietnam, right on the DMZ, the border between South Vietnam and North Vietnam, and so we'd put in sensors. So we had sensors that would go along the roads, and you could detect what kind of vehicles, and we could even pick their voices. Mm-hmm. So we had other people listening to the voices and the machinery, and but we would show the fighters where to lay it, and then report that back to headquarters. And then another mission we had was eventually in the Cambodia, which we really weren't supposed to be there, but we had some of our forward air controllers actually ended up as a Raven Fax. They call them Raven Fax. They were civilian, flew in civilian clothes. They were paid by the CIA, and they lived in Laos and Cambodia, and flew out of there with, they call them porters. It's a single engine airplane, and T-28s. And so we worked with them too. In fact, I flew 2 months. I flew their mission they had five of them get killed in 1 week. Mm-hmm. And while they were training other pilots, I went and flew out of Udorn with Air America, and we flew the plane of Jajars up in Laos, supporting General Van Pao, who was the commander of the Laotian military at the time. And so that was interesting. Got a lot of low-level flying done. Mm-hmm. We were strafing and stuff to keep their heads down and for the enemy. And so we did that. And then we ended up, they sent me down to Utapao, and we brought 5 OV-10s down there, and then our job there was to do recon in the western half of Cambodia. Mm-hmm. And so we basically took pictures with Pentax cameras, and so it wasn't too modern now. They could use Predators or Glowhawk, but we had a Pentax camera, and so if you flew 100 knots, and we had a little X in the windshield, and you'd fly that X into whatever you wanted to take a picture, and you put your elbow up here with a Pentax camera, and when you ran into the X you'd click, and the timing was put a dead center every time. Huh. Took a lot of practice to get there, but so we were flying some pretty low. We got pretty low on those. We were looking at villages on hillsides and back of trucks and stuff like that.
Do you remember any specific incidents where you were particularly scared, or was there any like harrowing experiences that you had?
Yeah, I had, well, there's a few, but one particular was first couple months I was there was in that 4 Alpha I was talking about in North Vietnam, South Vietnam, Laotian corner or area where they came together. And I'd just gotten out there and putting in, had four fighters ready to go. And so I had the target, I knew where it was, so I rolled in, set a rocket, came up, and usually we'd come up and turn upside down to see where the rocket hit, and then we'd tell the fighters where to hit from our smoke. Mm-hmm. So, hit. So when I come up about like this, 37 millimeter hit my engine and blew it up, and it just stalled it. Well, the props were variable props so we could feather them
Mm-hmm.
when they were stopped. So it wasn't like a speed board.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it stopped like a speed board. Then so then you could hit a. So I was going to go back because I got hit. So I told the fighters just to hit my smoke,
Mm-hmm.
and so until they were out of ammunition, and I'm heading back. And when they got done, one of the F4s come up and checked me out, and I had they had a panic. We call it the panic button. So it ejects your 4 rocket pods and your center wing tank, and the pods went, but I couldn't see the tank. And the fighter pilots come back and said, "Your tank's still on."
Mm-hmm.
And so oh man, and I'd just gotten there, so luckily I started to feed the wing tanks with the center wing tank, and then when it's full, then it'll overflow. And so I was losing about 200 feet a minute going back over, and I had to stay over the Ho Chi Minh Trail because the karst, they call it karst, is like mountains, sheer mountains, were on both sides of the trail. So I'm down below the trail. I got down to, before I could get it leveled, and basically pumped the fuel out of the tank till it got light enough. And with that prop out there too, I got down to less than 1,000 feet above the Ho Chi Minh Trail, straight and level. I could turn because it would, go lower. So I just prayed a lot, and I don't know if I couldn't tell if I got shot at or not, but they probably think I was stupid or trying to troll for them or something. But so I made it back. They called the rescue team out, and so I made it all the way back home. That was a gut wrencher there.
Mm-hmm. Imagine, yeah. Is there any other stories?
When I was doing with General Van Powell, they had a couple firefights going, and so I'd doing some strafing along the trenches where the enemy was, and so I could see these looked like flies going by, and luckily I was in a turn, and there was 50 caliber machine guns bullets, and so. I had a few of those. I got hit a few times. In fact, I had to, the first time it happened, I went back, told my crew chief, because it was just me and the crew chief along with the Air America guys. And the Air America guys would help and patch the holes for the next day. And so I said, I don't even want to know how many hits I got. I'm going to the bar with the Air America guys. and so, when we got done after 2 months, there was 309 bullet holes.
Wow.
So, but none of them hit me. So, I mean, it hit the cockpit. So, we ended up okay.
So, how long were you in Vietnam total?
Well, that particular assignment was a year.
Okay.
Yeah.
And you went back after that?
No. No, then I got assigned a really good assignment to Hawaii. Okay. And so, in fact, on the way to Vietnam, I stopped in and saw a neighbor who was a chief master sergeant. He was 10 years older than I was. We rode the school bus together when I was in 2nd grade, and he was in the 12th grade. And he was in rated assignments. But he was stationed at Hickam Air Force Base in Hawaii. So I stopped in and saw him. Well, he hadn't seen me since I was in the 2nd grade, right? So I come up, and I'm 6'2", and come up and knocked on his door. So we, surprised him. So I stayed there a day or so, and so he said, after I got talked to him, I was flying the 135s and that. Well, they had a squadron or a unit, they're called Blue Eagle in Hawaii, and but they were all senior guys. They were the pilots, the command pilots were all lieutenant colonels, and the co-pilots were all majors. And to get in the squadron itself, you had to have 2,500 hours. Be aircraft, even the co-pilots had to be aircraft commander qualified, and which meant they were older guys. And even the navigators were all majors and lieutenant colonels. And what they did is they flew, it was really a cushy job. They flew radar relay missions for the Navy, submarines. So they had a big, like 50-foot antenna, and then they were taking low frequency conversations, and then we had radar operators talking to them and transferring the information. And then two of the crews ended up flying. One flew the SINCPAC, which is the commander-in-chief of the Pacific Forces, and then the other was commander-in-chief of the Air Force, Pacific Air Force. And they were both 4-stars. And so one of the crews were the command crews, they call them. And so that sounded pretty neat. So anyway, when I was through, I had just over 2,500 hours. So I applied, and I think the old chief might have helped me. I don't know, because I got it. So I went in there and walked in as a captain. And how'd you get in here? so I got that, and about 9 months later, I got on the Stanival crew, which is the Stanival crew is actually evaluate the other crews, but mainly they flew the VIPs around. And so Admiral McCain he was the commander-in-chief of the Pacific Forces at the time, John S. McCain Jr.'s father. And so his crew was leaving. And so they took our Stanival crew, and we flew him around, and he liked us, so we ended up flying him then. So we were the SINCPAC command crew for the next 3 years.
Wow.
So we flew him, Admiral McCain, and his staff and his wife and her sister around the Pacific, actually around the world. So that was pretty neat. We went to every location in the Pacific that had either a Army base, Navy base, or Air Force base at least once a year. And so which included like Diego Garcia, Jakarta, Bali Beach, Australia, Hong Kong, so we went to some pretty neat places. Singapore. And then of course we went to Thailand and Taipei and Taiwan and Korea, Philippines, and Guam about every 3 months. So that was some neat experiences there.
What kind of aircraft did you fly?
That was a VC-135. Okay. It was like a 707. It had the fan engines instead of the water engines. Water for takeoff, you needed water on the regular tankers, but these had fans, so it was like a 707.
And how long were you at that assignment?
It was about 4.5 years total. So that was pretty neat.
And that was based out of Hawaii? Yeah. Okay.
And I was only there I was gone about 20 days a month. And so it was nice on the wife and kids. They had a good time.
Yeah, I imagine so, yeah.
Well, once we'd get back from the trips weren't very long. They're like 4 or 5 days. And then we'd stop back in Hawaii, say hi to the wives, and then we'd go to Washington, D.C. to debrief the Secretary of Defense. Well, the Admiral would, or the General would. We wouldn't. We'd go play golf or tennis or something. So we had it pretty nice.
So after that assignment, what was next for you?
Well, then, while I was there, I got my master's degree in systems management. And so when I went to leave, I found out I had an assignment to Ellsworth Air Force Base, and as a chief of Staff of Val. Well, I called one of the old chief master sergeants that worked there and that I knew from, he had moved from Hawaii there. And so after you find out how many hours I had more hours than the squadron commander and the Staff of Val guy. He said, they aren't going to leave you in there. You're going to end up at a command post with me. Mm-hmm. So I said, you know, I didn't really want to do that. And then, so then one of the, that was after Admiral McCain had retired. So my last year I'd flew the SINCPAC AF, the John Voigt, General Voigt, and he was on his way to get retired too, or not retire. Well, yeah, he did retire because he ended up as President Reagan's military advisor. Mm-hmm. And so before he left, he asked me what I wanted to do, you know, and so I'd had my assignment. And well, I don't really want that one, but I'd, you know, either go to the Pentagon or Air Academy or use my degree. Mm-hmm. So the academy was full. They always have the congressional selections. They don't, mm-hmm. You can't get in there too well easily, even with a 4-star endorsement. And and he tried it at the Pentagon, but I was still too young. I was still a captain yet, and so he knew the 4-star here, Jack Catton, and so he sent a telegram to him and asking me if he could find me a job, you know. And so about a week later, in fact, we were flying into Taiwan, and he came up to the cockpit and said that General Catton had just sent him a Twix, and so showed me and said, we got this new organization at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. It'll task his capability to the utmost, mm-hmm. Jack, you know. So I took it, and so then I ended up here. Mm-hmm. And that was when they started a numbered Air Force here, and they pulled out, I don't know how I ended up with these, but they were all distinguished graduates. We had 6 captains and a 2-star general and a full colonel and a GS-12 and a secretary. That's what we started with. And then General Jones, who was the chief of staff, directed us to create this numbered Air Force, which is 700 people mm-hmm. in a year. So the other captains were all distinguished graduates from AFIT, Air Force Institute of Technology, and me, and I was the only pilot. Mm-hmm. So the 2-star didn't like me because the 4-star made him take me, and he made it a little rough on me. But within about I think 6 months, I got selected to go to Defense Systems Management College, which is getting prepared to be a program director in Aeronautical Systems Command. Now it's division. And then we were to create the ALD, it's a Acquisition Logistics Division, which had a 3-star billet and 700 job descriptions. So while I was at school, at night I would write job descriptions. I wrote about 200 of them. And then when I come back out of school, then the 2-star that was the commander of the school ended up as our commander here, mm-hmm. as a 3-star. So I've had an in there. But then I got here, then I didn't know what I was going to be doing, but when ALD was created, and so they put me into as chief of the deployment division for the B-1A bomber. So I did that for about a year until it got canceled, and then ended up as the Director of Logistics for the Ground Launch Cruise Missile, along with about 26 other programs. That I had 2 offices, the director of logistics for the Glickham ground launch cruise missile was in Crystal City in Washington. I had another office here that had 26 other programs. They were strategic, different kind of programs. F-111 mods, and the B-1 was still there, but it wasn't the production. It was just for continued development. And B-52 mods and all kinds of mods. So I had another little office here doing the integration of those. So I'd go, Monday I'd go to either Crystal City or San Diego, where the manufacturer was. And then on Thursday I'd fly back here, and then in the afternoon I'd find out from my people that were working for me here what would happen, and then I'd debrief the general on Friday. Then I'd have, most of the time, I have Saturday and Sunday off, sometimes only Sunday. And so I did that about 9 months. And then went to command and staff, and while I was there, I went to comptroller school while I was there too. And then that was in 1979 when the Iranian hostages were, I think it was 53 of them or something, and were captured in Iran. So then the next thing I knew, I was getting assigned to Grissom Air Force Base. Well, what had happened was they were looking for, and I'd made major by then, and they were looking for somebody that had low-level flying, which is a forward air controller, refueling, all different kinds of refueling, had VIP type experience, CIA experience, and I was the only one in the Air Force that was a pilot. So, and I hadn't flown as I back here from 74 to 78. So I had flown for 4 years. So I had to go back and requal again through the 135 real quick. So I get back, check into Grissom, and found out they had, in fact, it was the same airplanes they flew over in Hawaii, but they took all the radio gear out. So now they were just RT-135, the receiver takers. So they were supporting the special forces, special operational forces, and where they'd go in and bring Rangers and helicopters and raid different places and capture people or whatever. And so the advantage of the RT was you'd fill, because you had short runways, like 8,000-foot runways. Well, a fully loaded 135 took 12,000 feet. So you'd fill the RT up half full and a regular tanker half full, and then you'd take off, and like, I can get into raid in a second, but then you'd take off, and then the RT would refuel and fill up. The other tanker would come back and land, and we'd go out and refuel whatever was to be refilled, which led to the Iranian hostage raid. And so we practiced that about 7 months and went to different isolated areas. Eglin Air Force Base, one, and so I had experience with about every one of them. And that one, I was the lead guy, and so usually, as I was the commander of the refueling unit, and I'd made lieutenant colonel by then. So we take off, and I lose water, this adjusted water, and first time I took off, it wouldn't, or I tried to take off, and it wouldn't come on. So sometimes if they had electronic little sensor there that if you banged it real hard, it'll come on. So I went back and tried to get, well, I'd already used some water. So I banged it, and it came on. So I just went ahead and went, because we didn't have any maintenance. We had to get there because it was like a war type of environment. We had to get to the 130. We were refueling 130s at 3,000 to 5,000 feet. And so went to take off, and the water ran out early. So now I was going down, and we were over water, but there was sailboats out there. It was like real late at night, and we were going down about 50 feet and barreling over these boats, and finally got it going. But we shocked the boaters, and then we'd go and had infrared lights. So there was no radar, nothing. So you had to go find. We knew where the 130 was supposed to be at a certain time. So we'd go and had infrared lights, and so the co-pilot, he'd keep his infrared goggles on, and then he'd find the 130, and then we'd go over the 130 at 270 knots and go back to idle, and when it went under the nose, and bring it back up to 190 knots. Well, 190 knots was below 10 knots below our stall speed. So I had to put 30 flaps down so that the 130 could come in and refuel. And then they would go and do their rating and with the Rangers and all, and then we'd go back home. The other time was at March Air Force Base, and we were supposed to go over to the China Lake area where that's where they had the compound. They would put it up at night and tear it down in the daytime. They'd raid it during the night. And so we were coming out and flying close to Las Vegas, and the other crew, one of the other crews, thought they saw the 130 because it was fairly low, about the right altitude. So they come over there. The airplane had stopped, and it was an airliner. So we had to get the CIA guys to go in and find this airline, and tell them not to report it or near miss. They had already reported it, but not to file it formally. So, and then so when we actually we still wasn't sure what we were going to be doing for sure until later. But so then about 3 months, no, about a month before the raid, they sent us to England, to Europe, and they had a tanker task force there that flew missions out of Europe. So we just went in there supposedly to join them. They said to pack for 90 days. So we had golf clubs, tennis rackets. And so they put us out in this little village, and there was 6 crews. We had 6 airplanes, 6 crews. So we're out in this little village, and we couldn't drink because we're on call all the time. And so after about 2 weeks, we got the call. So about 1 o'clock in the morning, actually about 11, we got there and got debriefed what we're actually going to be doing, where we're going to land. So we were going to go from England to a little classified base called in Egypt. So it was this Camp Alpha. And so to get there, we had to go across the corner of France. And France wasn't friendly at the time. And so we filed 3 United Airline call signs and for Cairo. So we were United. So they said if somebody comes up and, tries to intercept you or something, just disregard them and don't listen to them, and don't answer any calls, just go. So we filed, and then we get to Cairo, then we cancel our IFR clearance, and then went over to our base and landed there, and we were there, and then we got briefed with the C-130 crews on what was going to happen. And a couple of days later, they tried to raid the place, and they had a couple airplanes, a couple helicopters hit the 130s, and so they lost too many too many aircraft to take a chance. So they, if they lost any more, they wouldn't be able to get everybody out. So they canceled it.
Mm.
So then I come back and they asked me to come back here in the B-1B
Mm-hmm.
as a program manager, and so I did that until I retired in '85.
Wow, quite a career. Do you continue to fly today?
Not anymore. I did have a small airplane, a little Bonanza when I retired until about 2013.
Mm-hmm.
So then before I killed myself, I thought I better quit.
What did you do after the Air Force?
Well, then I started. Well, at first I went to work for a company, and then we did some consultant work. And then after about 9 months, a small business liaison on the Air Force base here at Wright-Patt asked me if I would be interested in becoming a multiple rep for different companies, small businesses. So I did that. After about 9 months, I had about 13 companies. I had to whittle it down. My mind couldn't separate them, and know what everybody's doing. So I had to make it down to, ratcheted it down to about 5 or 6, and did that for 10 or 12 years. And then one of the companies that was a disadvantaged company, I kept them for as a program manager and a marketing guy for 4 or 5 more years. And then I was going to retire, and then they asked me to come in when the Global Hawk come on board.
Mm-hmm.
So they asked me to come in as a consultant on that, and so I did that for 5 years, and then was going to retire again, and then the engine program office. They had a backlog of modifications that the using commands wouldn't fund, and they didn't know how much it was, so they needed somebody to help them put all that together. So I come back and did that, and ended up as about $2.5 billion worth of mods.
Mm-hmm.
They needed somebody that reason I picked me is I was a pilot. I could communicate with other pilots with the 4 letter words.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
In other words, take the engineering drawings and the problems they had and convert them into something that normal people could understand. And so, and then we sold them on it, and then tried to find the funds for them.
Mm-hmm.
And then, so it took us another 5 years to get all those done.
Mm-hmm.
And then retired in 1985.
Being a Vietnam veteran, were you ever treated adversely for?
Oh yeah, that was a bad. I personally, it wasn't as bad because I ended up in Hawaii,
Mm-hmm.
so I didn't get back in the States except for a month or so. So I didn't get treated, but my pilot cohorts, they got spit on, and basically it was. I think it was past the years of the hippie years, but there was politically people were against the war, and so anybody that was associated with the war, you were a criminal, So yeah, they didn't treat us too good. That wasn't too didn't make us feel too good.
Mm-hmm. What does your family think about life in the military?
Well, because they didn't like to see me gone all the time,
Mm-hmm.
but they got adjusted to it. I think it was the kids, other than they had to adjust. I think we moved 13 times,
Mm-hmm.
and 13 different schools they had to be in, and but they end up at the good part about it. The bad part is they had, lose your friends and that.
Mm-hmm.
But the good part is they kept some of the friends, and they'd moved, they were able to adjust and make other friends easier than
Mm-hmm.
the person that stayed in one spot. So they have a lot of friends,
Mm-hmm.
and same with my wife. She, of course, she had to do all the work raising the kids, and that was the bad part about that. And then, of course, when we'd come home for a year or long term, like my son, when I come back from he was only like 2 years old, so he didn't know who I was, and that was kind of tough. And then being able, to come over as a role of the, I guess in my opinion, parents, you have to have somebody that's the lead and somebody that's a follower. You need to agree, but it should be a lead. Well, in order to come back as the lead, it's not too easy because the wife's been the lead for a year. So you had to be real careful how you approach that. So the transition was pretty tough, but just had to work on it. And some people didn't do it very successfully, end up divorced.
You mentioned a book that you had written. Tell me a little bit about that.
Well, the reason I did it because I did know, and I encourage everybody that's, to write a book on themselves, at least the highlights. And so I knew my grandfather and my father had done some neat things, and I didn't know except for if I heard it from somebody else. So they never talked about it. And the World War II guys especially, they won't talk about it. And well, a lot of the people won't, but I found that it's actually therapeutic to do that. And also and I did some neat things, so historical things. And so when I figured my kids are going to be the same as I was. I didn't know, and so I said, and they're not going to ask me, and I'm not going to talk about it unless they ask me, and until I die, like I said, and then it's not going to be written down. So I started just writing things. It took me 6 years just to writing little situations down as I heard it, and then I'd go to reunions and get feedback of what had happened, and so make sure I wasn't exaggerating too much, right? And so then, and I was just going to do a word letter, or a little word file, a little project, and then somebody read it and said, "Well, you ought to publish it." So then I went back, and of course, as guys are, you don't say how you really felt, so it was really kind of boring. And so then they said, "Well, you make it a little." Well, how'd you feel? And so I try to go back and redo it, and like getting shot at. It's like 4th of July, and you try to explain some of your emotions. So I try to do that, and it made it a little more interesting. And I try to bring in where God was flying on my shoulder. He pretty much led me down the paths and took care of me, still is. So that was the reason I did it. So I just kind of did highlights from when I ran away when I was 3 years old until 2006.
What's your book called?
Born to Live on the Edge.
Okay. I like the title. So you mentioned that you go to some reunions. Do you get involved in any veterans activities as well as the reunion?
Yeah. Well, I was president of the Dayton Area Military Officers Association of America, and so I'm active in that. And that's all services. It's a lobbyist group for all services. And then of course, I'm active with the American Legion and VFW, and locally here I'm on the Air Force Association Executive Board, so I keep my hands in things through that. And of course, then after I retired, probably after maybe 10 years, 1999, I think, 98, then I ran for office, city council. So city councilman for Fairborn and deputy mayor 2 years of that, and that was interesting. And the reason I did that was, there were things that need to be changed, and always believed in if you're going to want changes, you better participate and be part of it, or you isn't going to get changed. So I was on a lot of committees and still am. Still on six, I think 5 or 6 boards and 7 or 8 committees. And most of them involved with the city or the county.
Do you still keep in contact with friends or buddies in the Air Force?
Yeah, a lot of friends all over the place. So we have, well, for one thing, we have reunions. Like, there's one squadron, the original squadron I was in KISR in Michigan was 46th Air Refueling Squadron, and so we have a little reunion of the crews from there. And so we get together about every 2 years. And then the Ford Air Controllers Association, every 2 years we meet also. We meet about, I think there's 600 active members out of about 5,000. I'm the database manager, so I know who they are. And then I play golf on the base with a lot of Air Force guys. And I have Air Force friends all over. Like I just got back from California 2 days ago, visiting a guy I flew with in Hawaii. And so it's a small world, so you just kind of keep contacting. Stop by and see them when I'm in their area. A lot of them.
Kind of wrapping up here. Do you have a message for future generations that might be viewing this interview?
Well, one thing is encourage everybody to, like I say, tell their story, because if you don't tell it, nobody's ever going to know, even your kids. And it also helps, I think, document some of the history and maybe encourage younger people to serve. It is an honor to serve the country. And so that's the main reason.
Well, Fred, you've had a fascinating career. Enjoyed hearing the stories about Vietnam and those missions you flew. Is there anything that we haven't covered that you'd like to talk about?
Well, there's one that probably I didn't cover is when I was flying Admiral McCain. He loaned us, the crew in the airplane, to escort General Westmoreland out of Vietnam when the POWs were released in 1973. And so we went into Saigon and we were flying out of Hawaii. Well, my neighbor across the street was the guy, Lieutenant Colonel Dick Abel. He was in Hanoi doing the negotiations or taking care of other arrangements to get the POWs go. So we had already had a prearranged communications deal through high-frequency radio to communicate, make sure the POWs got off and all that. So we flew into Saigon, and then General Westmoreland, in fact, our airplanes parked here in a big grandstand over here, and so that was probably 100 or 2 people. And then General Westmoreland presented a big gold key to General Key, KY, who took the military back from the U.S. That was the significance of it. And then the general and his staff jumps on our airplane where the general gets in the jump seat. So we're taxiing out to take off, and so I call Dick at Hanoi and say, the POW is off yet, because we're going to make sure we didn't leave until the last POW was off. And no, they won't come out. And so told the general, and the general says, "You tell those buttholes we aren't leaving here until the last POW is off the ground." So I relayed that. So said, well, they aren't. It's going to be a while. Okay, we went back. So we stayed in Saigon a couple more days. Well, then finally we got word they were going to release them, and then when the last POW left off, we started engines and left. And then another neat story was when we went to Kadena and they went to Clark to get debriefed. Well, their call sign was Homecoming 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and ours was Juna 6-6. So I heard the Homecoming on the report going out of Hanoi, and I said, "Homecoming, this is Juna 6-6. You don't have Jim Latham on board. He was a Ford air controller, got through his year, come back, checked out in the F4, got married, went back for a year. Well, about this 20th mission, he got shot down. So he was a POW for about 18 months. But he was my student, I knew. So the reason I asked for him, and so the other pilot in the C-141 said, "Yeah, Pumroy, I got him out here in the jump seat." I didn't say my name. He recognized my voice. It was another Ford air controller who completed his year, went back in the 141s and volunteered to go back in to get them. So I talked to them for a while. And then we met them, and they went through Hawaii. I brought him a liquor lay, which they immediately took away. They wouldn't let him have it because it didn't want to have alcohol. So, but I did get to talk to him, wife gave him a hug, all that. Well, then we come back here. Well, it was only a couple years ago when there's a guy, a POW that was there for 6.5 years, Ed Meckenbauer, who lives here or used to live here in Dayton, and was a major general reserves. And he wrote a book on his life and situation in a POW camp in Hanoi. And I read that book. Well, I switched him, we switched books. So I read that, and I found out why the 3 days. Well, they had, Jane Fonda had been there the year before, and with her little publicity stunt. And so they thought it was another one because the North Vietnamese were feeding them good, and they were fixing, medically fixing them up and give them new clothes to wear. So there was another publicity stunt, and so they weren't going to leave until Dick come in and convinced them that it was okay. So that was the reason. So anyway, and then Jim Latham, he ended up flying as a wingman for the Thunderbirds, and then later, after they crashed, he come back as the lead for the Thunderbirds and the F-16s, and retired as a 2-star general. So they all did well. And that's about the only other, I have some other neat ones, but we're probably getting to the end here.
Well, Fred, I really appreciate you coming out here and sharing your story with us. It's an honor. Yeah, that concludes the interview of Fred Pumroy. Thank you.